In the last episode of Thematic Breakdowns, we talked about the importance of the music that accompanies the logos in Star Wars Jedi Survivor. We discussed how the importance of this music stems from the idea that this is where immersion begins. Before you even pick up the controller, this very small cue draws you into the game. We also talked about the difference between music in film and games, and while doing so, introduced a term about game sound theory. So, as promised in the last episode, this time, Thematic Breakdowns presents Episode 8, Transdiegetic Sound and the Immersion of Game Music. You are roaming in a vivid forest full of the sound of rustling trees and birds. Nature is alive and you take enjoyment from your surroundings. You feel at peace as your curiosity wanders in the green landscape you walk through, listening to falling leaves and bird tunes. But suddenly, nature goes silent. You become aware of the sound of your feet. You hear heavy, slow-paced flapping above you. You hear a bellow, and before it is visible, a dragon has announced itself. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, sound is a particular auditory impression. These auditory impressions surrounding us help us communicate, locate, and navigate the different spaces we journey, and allow us to recognize elements that lack clear visual stimuli, like birds in a dense forest. Sound, ultimately, along with other elements, create immersion. And that is what we're going to talk about today, specifically in video games. So let's begin by understanding what transdiegetic sound is. In film, there are basically two types of sound, diegetic and extradiegetic, or non-diegetic. Diegetic sounds are all the sounds that originate from within the story's world, for example dialogue, or a dinosaur roaring in Jurassic Park. On the other hand, extradiegetic sound or non-diegetic sound is sound that comes from outside the story's world. For example, usually, music, like when you hear the Imperial March when Darth Vader pops into your screen. However, games have an interactive factor that we must take into account, which makes the previous theory not really applicable to the subject, because in a film, the protagonist's story immerses the audience through passive participation. Meanwhile, the player becomes the protagonist in a game, therefore they're immersed by giving them control over the decisions and actions through active participation. So, to understand transdiegetic sound better, let's look at the game components Carter et al. Developed. These are basically 4 layers that help us understand the way we, as humans, interact with games. We begin with the user. This is the human playing the game. Then we have the player, which is the social identity the user forms. Then we move on to the character, which is the in-game identity, Batman, for example. And finally we have the avatar, which is the physical manifestation of that character. So when you look at your screen and Batman is there, that is the avatar. And here's where things get tricky, because although the character does not hear the extradiegetic music, the information that cue carries will be transferred to the user, who will interpret it as the player, react to it, and control the character accordingly. And that is why it is impossible to apply the division between diegetic and non-diegetic sound in games. So, that is where transdiegetic sound comes into play. Transdiegetic sound is the function diegetic and extradiegetic sounds have in games, as these, as we mentioned before, have the power to influence the diegetic action of the game through the information they relay to the player, breaking the previously defined boundaries in film music theory. So within transdiegetic sound we have 2 types, external and internal. Let's begin by understanding what external transdiegetic sound is. These sounds are all the non-diegetic sounds that communicate something about the diegesis, about the game's world, like repetitive music cues. If you hear fighting music, you know a fight is going to happen and you're going to control the character accordingly. On the other hand, internal transdiegetic sounds are diegetic sounds that communicate about the game's world without addressing other elements. For example, a character giving you a hint to inform you which path to take, Now, I know there are a lot of words that sound very similar right now, but have very different meanings, as that is why we're going to take a look at some examples in a moment. But before, I just wanted to mention that the reason us as users can process all of this is because of meta communication, which is our ability as humans to understand several frames of reference simultaneously, creating immersion through the way they communicate with each other. So we're going to take a look at two games, two examples, Skyrim and Batman Arkham Knight. Let's begin with Skyrim. Right now we're going to take a look at an example that talks about internal transdiegetic sound, which is basically around the idea of character hints. Let's take a listen.
You look sick. I hope it's not contagious.
So if we break this very simple example, we have the NPC informing the character that they look sick. This information is then relayed to the user, who reacts to it as a player by seeking an antidote or some way to heal themselves. Let's take a look at another example.
I find your hand in my pocket. I'm going to cut it off.
Here we have guards suggesting caution, and it's basically the same process. The NPC is informing the character that if they steal, there's going to be repercussions. That information from the character is relayed to the user, and then the player reacts accordingly. Whether they decide to steal or not, that's the player's decision. Now let's take a look at external transdiegetic sound. Let's begin by taking a look at the way music playlists work for safety conditions. Here we have music, and the music is informing the user, ooh, something dangerous is around us, in this case a dragon. Now that user is relaying the information to the player, who is reacting to it as a character. Let's take a look at another example. Now that is the music cue that accompanies the leveling up, and it's basically the same process. The music is informing the user, ooh, you've leveled up, and the user relays that information to the player, who reacts as the character by going to the perks and skills and upgrading different stuff. Now, if we were to create a formula to understand what's happening, it's basically this. A is informing B about something, and then B is relaying that information to C so that it reacts as D. So it's not a straight line. Diegetic and non-diegetic sound cannot be properly divided here. And that is why transdiegetic sound exists. Whether it is sounds coming from within or outside the game world, there is a line that describes how all of these elements interact through metacommunication. Now let's take a look at Batman Arkham Knight. We're going to start by looking at an example of internal transdiegetic sound, a sound Batman hears that the player reacts to. Now, it is the same process as in Skyrim. The helicopter guard is informing the user danger is around. So the user relays that information to the player and reacts as Batman, going towards the danger or not going towards the danger. That's the interactive factor of games. But that is how ideas are communicated. Now let's take a look at external transdiegetic sound. Now what I want to specifically take a look at here is how the music is informing the user the fight is done. You have a big climax in the music, that means you've beaten the last thug. So the user is relaying that information to the player, who is reacting as Batman, taking time to heal, I don't know. But that's the way that music carries that information, all the way from the user to the character. So even when in an internal transdiegetic sound, sounds come from within the game world, or external transdiegetic sound where sounds come from outside the game world, the sounds are breaking the boundaries between the character and the user. And that is, in a nutshell, what transdiegetic sound is about, and how it enhances immersion of game music, because through metacommunication, it breaks those boundaries and draws you in. You have absolute control of every single decision the character does. Now, if you want to know more about the subject, which I think as composers it's our responsibility because it is important to understand theoretically how our music is interacting with the game and the player, there is a free research paper I wrote a while back on my website for free. I'm going to leave the link in the description. It is way more theoretical, but I promise it's a good read. And with that, this episode of Thematic Breakdowns comes to an end. So thank you very much for checking it out. I hope the terminology didn't get too messy because there are a lot of words that sound the same. Thankfully, the video is here for you to watch as many times as you need. If you liked it, the button is down below. If you want to stay up to date with more content, the button is also down below. And the link to buy me a coffee is in the description, as that really helps me with being able to keep this series going forward. So thank you very much for checking this episode out. I hope it was useful. I hope you check out the research paper, and I'll see you on the next one.